Thank you, Morgan. And I think you know that the love is mutual. I'm going to do this thing where I'm going to take this off of here because I'm going to navigate the PowerPoint myself, and I'll need to move about. But again, I'd like to start by honoring the land and territory that we stand on, and I'm going to try to pronounce the Lekaboo clan and Kitsma clan nation. And it's really important for me to try to get names right, but I also struggle with maybe the speakers. I may have to. Can I go here without it squeaking? Yeah. Okay. I also want to say that I'm humbled in the last 2 days, yesterday, last evening, and this morning, listening to very powerful, strong, and yet very compassionate Aboriginal women who, despite my nervousness of presenting today, who have empowered me to say what I need to say and share what I need to share with you. And in putting this presentation together, I had some email communication with Morgan in terms of talking about men's work, my experience in working with men today. And I want to acknowledge Carol. There she is. Carol also assisted in the presentation, as well Jamie Katz, who's not here today, and our dear friend Elaine Hamilton, who is no longer with us, but much of the work that I'm going to be presenting is the hard work that was done by many in the past that I had the privilege of presenting. Let me start very quickly by saying that I work for an organization in East Vancouver named Mosaic. It's an immigrant serving organization, and our work there is working with immigrants in their settlement and integration process. There I have the privilege of working with a number of violence prevention programs, and we have 3 very different programs for men in our organization that focus on services to immigrant men. And one is a court-mandated program where men come after they've gone through conviction. Another one is a voluntary program, and quite often the Ministry of Children and Families end up referring men to it. And the third program that we've recently started is called Connecting Fathers. And again, this is for single fathers on parenting issues and so on. I'll have to go that way, yeah. And so myself, I have, in addition to my work at Mosaic in an administrative capacity, I also run a treatment program for South Asian men from my community with another male facilitator. So today I'm going to be talking to you, I'm going to share a bit of my personal story as it relates to the work that I do. I'm also going to share with you a little bit about history of men's treatment and working with men in BC. As well, I'm going to share some guiding principles that have been developed that I think are really useful to use as a guide to either look at programs that exist in your community, or if you're thinking about starting up new programs in your community. And then I want to leave you with some questions, because I want to acknowledge that the guiding principles that I'm going to present to you are really developed from a mainstream service delivery perspective. Many individuals who are involved with developing these guiding principles work with mainstream programs. And though we had, at that time, we had representation from, I remember Bob, for example, from the Aboriginal community, and some of us from the immigrant communities were involved, but still the framework for the principles had been developed from mainstream. So I'm going to leave you with some questions that you can go away with and actually question about the guiding principles and see if they fit, see if the language fits, and so on. So today my topic is accountability for violence, guiding principles for intervention to increase safety. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is programs for men who use violence. And what we want to look at is how these programs can be effective, how they can be accessible and ethical in practice. So let me start by sharing who I am. And I did this very fancy thing where things come up one at a time. And one is that I'm not an Aboriginal woman. And I'm honored to be in this territory speaking with you on issues of Aboriginal women. And also want to say that what I say is things that come from my experience in my work, working with various models that have been developed from a mainstream service delivery. And I constantly, today, struggle with how to take those mainstream models and make them really practical within the context of my community. And I invite you to do the same thing. I am here as a sister who's learning. I learned a lot and I continue to learn today. And also I want to figure out how to be an ally. I'm hoping that the next time this gathering happens, that the person presenting on issues of men and men's treatment will be an Aboriginal man or an Aboriginal woman. And I'd be happy to support and give whatever knowledge, information I've gathered from my work. I came to Canada when I was 10. Go through this quickly. I went to school in the 70s and 80s in Victoria. I grew up amongst an extended family. We had my uncles living with us for a while until they moved out. I was not allowed to have a boyfriend. This was a sort of a cultural thing, and though my father never really ever sat me down and said, you know, you're allowed to see boys and you're allowed to have a boyfriend, but I knew it was definitely a cultural norm in my family. I want to share with you the story about the man and the woman who got married, and the man wanted to figure out how to dominate her from day one. So he gets up in the morning and he says, you know, this is, so you have to remember, this is a kind of India context joke, so you know, there was no hot water, no running hot water, so he says, I want a bucket of hot water for me ready in the morning so I can take a shot, you know, wash myself. So she says, okay, she's scared, she warms up the water for him. So he does this for about a month, and she's a bit scared, and every morning she warms up the water and he takes a shower, and she's thinking, what the heck? So he says again to her with kind of this voice and says, I want you to warm up the water for me, or else. And she says, well, or else what? She thought, let me just see what he will say. He says, or else I'll have to take cold water and shower with that. And so I think same is true for my experience with this boyfriend thing, because my father never sat me down, but I just knew that within our culture, girls are not to have boyfriends, that at some point we were going to have a boy selected for us and that we were going to have this arranged marriage. And so the other thing that was kind of significant was that we came from a Sikh culture, and Sikhs traditionally didn't cut their hair. And this was very problematic. You can imagine in the 80s when we were watching Farrah Fawcett with her hair and Charlie's Angels. You remember we had the feathered hair? Well, you know, and here I was wearing a pony and at times, you know, with two pigtails. And really, you know, just didn't fit in the context. And again, what's very interesting is that my dad actually wasn't very religious. You know, as Mavis, you were talking about your father, he was actually rather an atheist and was kind of against fundamental Sikh principles. But on a cultural level, he would use those values of the religion and kind of, you know, in a very subtle way impose them on us. And I have to say it was very embarrassing. I used to play sports in high school, and I had very hairy legs, and I couldn't shave my legs. You know, so I had to wear socks up to here, and I kept used to pulling them up. And so again, some of these things that were part of my culture in a sort of a subtle way at home, when I would go home, it was really comfortable, it was the way everybody understood. But when I would be outside in a school context, all of a sudden, I had to I was an imposter there, right? And the other thing was that my experience of my culture was really normal for me. So I was quite happy to have an arranged marriage. I had my good friend Paul, and one time it was snowing, snowed a lot in Victoria. It only happens I think once or twice a year in Victoria. And it was snowing a lot, and I used to take the bus to EVA, and he saw me standing, he came by, picked me up, and I said to him in the car, I said, you know that we can't be boyfriend and girlfriend because I'm going to have arranged marriage. And he kind of looked at me and said, you know, I'm just giving you a ride because I thought it was kind of cold. So, you know, that was my script. That was my script. Anyhow, the story goes, the way it worked out for me is I got to see many boys. You know, my parents would introduce me and I would say yeah or nay. And finally, I found a very compatible boy, man. And I got married, and it was the fairy tale, and I started to live with his family. We started to have conflict in my marriage in the first week. I remember driving down to California, kind of our honeymoon, and I remember sitting for about 5 hours in the car like this, looking outside while, I don't know, he was doing something. I don't remember. So inevitably, my experience was one of power from him, and one of privilege and abuse. And actually, what I realized, I think at that stage, was that the honeymoon was over. And what I had to start to deal with, or what I had to start to look at, was how I grew up as a South Asian woman in my culture that was different than the partner I chose. So though you would look at us and say, wow, what a handsome couple. But really what was going on inside me and what was going on inside him and who we individually grew up was very different. And it was gender-based. There was something inside of that was about him growing up as a boy in my culture, and there was something about that of me growing up as a girl in my culture. And so that's why I share some of the funnies with you, because though it seems a bit comical, but that actually was how I saw my culture. And I wore it as a badge right here on my culture. You know, quite proud of it. You know, though I wanted to get my hair feathered, but at the same time, it was my culture. And I was going to go and have an arranged marriage, and it was all going to work out. And the ultimate story is I had a child in that relationship, and we divorced. And so, why is my story important in my work with men? Is the dilemma that I certainly experienced, and I'm putting this out because I'm assuming that some of my Aboriginal sisters may experience the similar dilemmas. And one is the loyalty to our cultural practices versus naming the male dominance and violence in our communities. And also there's a sense of belonging, because part of me wearing the badge of my culture is because outside of my culture, you know, somebody in the room yesterday said that they had experiences of being called a dumb Indian. Well, I've had experiences growing up in the 70s and 80s being called an ugly Indian and not belonging. You know, the girl with the pigtail doesn't get dates, doesn't get asked out. I mean, not once did I get asked out. so that I could reject him. Not once, you know? And the other is understanding violence against our men. So, you know, my father, who drove taxi for many years, would come home with many stories of racism, and many of the immigrant men that not necessarily from India, but from other countries where they've had experiences of war trauma. Understanding violence against our men versus naming violence by our men. So how do we deal with that dilemma? And the other is the values versus practice, right? Which is that we have a lot of common values across humanity, but it's the practices that get in the way that start to create difference. So how do we go back to values? I haven't even got to my presentation yet. Very quickly. So the other thing that happens is if you have a program in your community, or if you're thinking about having a program in your community, quite often we have lots of questions about services for men, treatment for men, and we have questions like, are men deserving of services, or should we be focusing on victims? Why is it women's work to fix the men? This morning I think Paul and Mavis's presentation was beautiful, and Paul challenging the men to say, why is it that the women are carrying the load? And asking the men to step up. Does treatment and education work? We have questions about that. Do men learn to become better emotional abusers if they go through treatment? We want to ask, is violence acceptable in some cultures? Are there some culture we get scared to ask and confront violence sometimes because we wonder if there's a cultural context behind that? And do men need to address the impact of colonization and residential schools and other systemic discriminations before they deal with the violence they're using against the people they love? And so these are questions that we all need to ask ourselves, but really at the end of it, there is a belief that we need services for men and that we need treatment for men because women want it. How many of you work with women who said, I wish there was something for my partner? How many, right? And women want it because they want to be safe. They don't necessarily want their relationship to end, right? Women want the man to change and they want to give him help. Men need treatment, men need support, healing, because they need to take responsibilities, no excuses. We need to deal with the other things separately, but we also need to hold men accountable for the violence they use against people they love. And they also need to learn to respect women, humanity, Mother Earth, as we've been hearing the last 2 days. And also community. It's important to have services for men because services for men are an essential part of coordinated response to domestic violence. I'm going to skip the pillars. So very quickly, the history of treatment programs of men in BC. Treatment for men actually started in the prisons. And eventually what happened is, as domestic violence, the justice system started to take it seriously, men who were convicted went through they ended up on probation. And they ended up needing treatment. So treatment came into the community. And in the 80s and 90s, there were many programs across BC. And I'm not sure, Carol, how many before the programs collapsed. I think it was like 80 or 90 or something like that. So there were small programs all over the community. And a lot of them had a community context to them. Many were Aboriginal programs with various Aboriginal practices incorporated in them. And I know when I was in Vancouver, there were many programs in existence. And corrections. Maybe I'll go over that in a minute. And in 1989, an organization came together, which was counselors, Association of Counselors Working with Abusive Men. And in 1990, developed some guiding principles so that it could be shared across the province, so that we had some common belief about what we think goes into these treatment programs. About 80 people gathered to give input, and then what they were revised in 2000 because we heard from advocates who looked at these guiding principles and who gave us further insight into what needs to be done. How much time do I have, Morgan? Oh, not too much. Okay, I'll keep going. See what you get to do when you're a woman of color. White woman of color. Good. So really quickly, what I want to say to you is this is also a really important slide, is in 2003, corrections basically took away funding from many programs that existed across the province, and there was a process in place, the request for proposal RFP, and the RFP was won by one service provider, who then tried to reinstate some of these programs in the province. But really, the result of that is we lost capacity across the province of treatment programs. You know, programs that worked within the context of that community, we lost that capacity. And also, as a result, we don't have consistent services in our province. So why did we need the guiding principles in 1990? It was important to recognize that the work that happens with men who use violence, the counseling that we do with men who use violence, is different in nature than any other counseling. One is because when you're working with a man in a group, your client actually is the woman that he has used violence against. So when you have a man that comes into your group and you start to deal with whatever is going on, you're trying to create change, and there's the man is experiencing or working through his own trauma, his own use of violence, well, he's coming up with all sorts of emotions, you know, things that happen in counseling context. But we, the counselor, have to be aware that he's going home to the woman that evening after our group ends. So our work doesn't stay in the group. So really it was important to understand that even though the victim is not in the room, there are clients, that there's a certain philosophy and analysis that service providers, program model needed to have that looked at services for women and safety for women at the same time that we develop programs for men. Need to create engagement and accountability at the same time. So we needed to focus on the work with men as well as safety for women. Now, I'm going to talk, so these are the guiding principles, and you're going to have access to these guiding principles. They're on the EVA website. There's a number of guiding principles that you can go in, and I mean, there's this one, but there's also other bulletins around men's work that you can look at. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight number one, which is that in working with offenders, physical and emotional safety of victims is the highest priority. And again, I want to highlight one other one, is that number two, is the provision for effective, accessible, and ethical services for offenders is essential in ending relationship abuse. What that means is that if you have a program in a community for men, that program should be working in collaboration with services to women, should be working in collaboration with health services, should be working in collaboration with transition houses, for example, and what have you. So it's important that that program isn't just isolated by itself and that it's actually incorporated. So I'm going to, in my workshop, go into the guiding principles a little bit more, and I'm sorry, I want to respect, even though I've taken up a lot more time, I want to respect those other speakers after me, but that you can have access to the guiding principles. The other few questions I want to leave you with, that when you look at these guiding principles and you have a program in your community, or you're thinking about a new program in your community, some questions that I'm putting out here that again came from Carol and others, is that do these principles fit? Does the language fit? If it doesn't, what else needs to be added or taken away? Also, what does women-centered ethical treatment services look like in your community? What are some of the critical, realistic safety consideration strategies necessary in providing services in your community? And also, something that's coming up a lot that I've been hearing the last couple of days is that there are some key values that your community and that your culture holds. How can you look at those key traditional values to support men's work? And where to go from here? Once again, if you have services in your community that are working for men, take these principles and you can look at them and see if they make sense for you. You can change the language, you can try to make it fit in your context. If you're thinking about starting a new program, you can also do that. But I'd also really like to say to you is that come together and be the voice. Make some noise if you don't have services for men. Come together and use EVA as an ally to provide support to you to get this going. Thank you very much.